There's an old marketing saying that advises sales folks to sell the sizzle, not the bacon, meaning you'll make more sales if you emphasize the intangibles more than the actual product, especially if the product ain't particularly good. And if there's one thing New Testament apologists is good at, it's selling the sizzle. Hey there, folks. Bert from the Barely Bearable Atheist here, continuing our series on the book I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist by Norm Geisler and Frank Turek. We's up to chapter 10, entitled, Do We Have Early Testimony About Jesus? And notice, it ain't asking if and we has reliable early testimony about Jesus. It's just asking if we has any early testimony at all. And of course we do. We got lots of early testimony about Jesus, and a lot of it is considered heretical by the Christian church today. Out of all the reports and legends and testimonies and other historical evidence, the church cherry-picks only those testimonies that reinforce church doctrine and disregards the rest. But from a historical perspective, that's putting the cart before the horse. If you want a reliable historical account of Jesus, you got to consider all the evidence, pro and con, which in a lot of cases we can't do because the church destroyed so much of it. But in any case, Geisler and Turek ain't going to look at any of the evidence from outside the official traditions of the church. Right from the get-go, we's only going to get a one-sided presentation of the evidence. But first, they's going to give us what they call, quote, 10 known non-Christian writers who mention Jesus within 150 years of his life, end quote. And the first of these is Josephus, who wrote something like this, quote, At this time, the time of Pilate, there was a wise man who was called Jesus. His conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous. And many people from among the Jews and the other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die, but those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion, and that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah, concerning whom the prophets have recounted wonders. End quote. Now I say something like this because the manuscripts we have today are much more emphatically Christian in expressing the idea that Jesus was definitely the Christ and definitely rose from the dead, which is something that a non-Christian Jew like Josephus would be highly unlikely to say. The version I just read is the version that Geisler and Turek put in their book, and it's based on an early translation of the text into Arabic, which don't have the embellishments that appear in the manuscripts handed down to us by Christian sources. And it might be worth mentioning that the earliest of these manuscripts only dates back to the 10th century CE, so plenty of time for a certain number of corrections to have crept in as it was being copied over by hand. But notice here what Josephus is reporting. A popular teacher was executed by crucifixion, and his disciples claimed he rose from the dead. And that ain't all that controversial, actually. The fact that Jesus existed and that he founded a religion that claimed he rose from the dead ain't anything that many people would disagree with, even if they's atheists. The sizzle that Geisler and Turek is trying to sell is the notion that he really did rise from the dead and perform many other miracles that proved him to be the Son of God. But that ain't what they got, at least not from non-Christian sources anyways. Let's look at Tacitus, one of their other non-Christian sources. Now, they don't tell you who these non-Christian sources are in the main text of the book. They's just listed in the endnotes at the back of the book. And even there, it don't say what the non-Christian testimony actually says. You're going to have to do some digging to find out the details. So I've gone ahead and done that. According to Tacitus, there was, quote, a class hated for their abominations called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate, end quote. Again, no bacon, just a man named Christus who was executed by Pontius Pilate, and that ain't controversial. So how about Pliny the Younger, another non-Christian who mentioned Jesus? Quote, others, whose names were given me by an informer, first said that they were Christians and afterwards denied it, declaring that they had been, but were so no longer, some of them having recanted many years before, and more than one so long as 20 years back. But they declared that on a stated day they had been accustomed to meet before daybreak and to recite a hymn among themselves to Christ as though he were a god. End quote. And I probably should have skipped the part where he says they all denied being Christians, but that's such a contrast with the standard Christian narrative about the faith of the martyrs that I just had to keep it in. But again, no bacon, just sizzle. Pliny mentions the existence and traditions of Christianity, neither of which is in dispute. So let's look at one more, Suetonius. Quote, "Since the Jews constantly made disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus, he expelled them from Rome." End quote. And this one ain't even clear that he's talking about Jesus and not some other guy named Chrestus. A lot of folks assume that he meant Christ, but it ain't explicitly spelled out, so at best we've got Suetonius relaying a garbled reference. And that's basically how it goes for the rest of the non-Christian references to early Christianity. They mention that Christianity exists, and they mention some of the Christian traditions and teaching, and they mention that it was founded by some feller that got executed, and beyond that, not a whole lot. Some pretty low-grade sizzle here, and no sign of any actual bacon. Geisler and Turek tries to hype up their claims by arguing that there's only 9 sources that mention the Emperor Tiberius Caesar in the same time frame, but that's a fairly misleading comparison considering that the references to Tiberius come from actual historians who cite their sources and contain long, detailed accounts of the life of the emperor, as contrasted with stray sentences and isolated paragraphs referring to somebody whose name sounds like Christ or Christus or something. And I don't even get into the other evidence of Tiberius, like archaeological finds and such. So yeah, Geisler and Turek is trying to hype up some sizzle here in the absence of any actual bacon. And from here they goes on and spends a good few pages talking about how accurate and how early the New Testament manuscripts is, which is kind of a red herring on account of the history of the manuscripts ain't really what's important here. The Mormon Church has some of the original handwritten manuscripts of the Book of Mormon from the scribes who was taking dictation from Joseph Smith himself. But having the actual original manuscripts ain't no guarantee that what's written in them is true, as I'm sure Geisler and Turek would agree. But notice that Geisler and Turek is limiting their discussion to the 27 canonical New Testament books and assuming that they was all written by eyewitnesses. Quote, "Numerous people independently witnessed New Testament events. Many of them committed it to memory, and 9 of those eyewitnesses/contemporaries put their observations in writing. The New Testament documents are 27 different documents that were written on 27 different scrolls by 9 different writers over a 20 to 50 year period." End quote. And this is what you might call a highly curated account of the origin of New Testament documents, to put it kindly. Although a more accurate description might fall somewhere between misleading and outright dishonest. And you gotta love how they specify that these supposed eyewitnesses, quote, "committed it to memory," unquote, as if that somehow makes it more reliable than just going by ordinary memory. And just to put this all in perspective, consider the fact that there was an entire generation of middle-aged adults when the first gospel was written who weren't even born when the events described by the gospel supposedly happened. During the first few decades of the church, there was no New Testament, and church doctrines was passed on primarily by word of mouth. As you might imagine, this gave rise to a number of different oral traditions, not all of which were later accepted as orthodox by the church councils. Conditions like that favor the development of variations that's more likely to go viral over variations that stick closer to the original facts. And that's an important point that deserves to be mentioned because it shows how volatile church doctrine was in the days before the first New Testament documents was written. But of course, Geisler and Turek don't mention it because that'd undercut their apologetic. They only mention the 27 documents that the 3rd century church cherry-picked from all the traditions that arose out of the 1st century, and that's anachronistic. Nobody in the first century knew which manuscripts was going to be canonized in the third century, and there were competing views about who Jesus was and what he did and what it all meant. But history is written by the winners, and that's the only history that Geisler and Turek is going to be commenting on. As for the authors all being eyewitnesses and or contemporaries of eyewitnesses, well, that don't count for as much as Geisler and Turek would like folks to think it does. Eyewitnesses can be unreliable, and memories is subject to change under the right kinds of pressure, so it's important to measure their stories up against the infallible standard of objective reality to see what's really consistent with the truth. I mean, just look at how long it took conspiracy theorists to remember seeing missiles fired at buildings on 9/11 and pre-planted explosive charges detonating to bring down buildings and all the other hoaxes that they's absolutely convinced is true. I mean, we's talking days, if not hours, and definitely not decades like we see in the New Testament. What's more, we can't really be sure who wrote many of the New Testament documents apart from the Apostle Paul, and even then there's reasons to believe that not all the letters attributed to Paul was actually written by him. We have church traditions that claim to know who wrote each of the various books of the New Testament, but when you start to investigate those traditions, a lot of them boil down to they heard it from a guy who heard it from a guy, and so on. And if we can't be sure who the author even was, we definitely can't justify the claim that they was necessarily eyewitnesses or contemporaries of eyewitnesses. So what we've actually got is decades of oral traditions between the events described in the Gospels and the earliest of those Gospels. And we got some kind of iffy traditions about who wrote those Gospels. And we got other Gospels that record traditions that the 3rd century church rejected, and so they didn't get into the canon. Plus we got a bunch of letters written by Paul and or somebody pretending to be Paul, and miscellaneous other letters by various folks, some of which made it into the canon and others didn't. But out of all that, the lesson that Geisler and Turek wants us to take away is that the New Testament was written by eyewitnesses and their buddies who we can very definitely trust because they not only remembered what they seen, they committed it to memory. And from here, they go on to talk about the science of textual criticism, which is an actual skeptical science that tries to reconstruct what the original text of the New Testament was by reconstructing how the different manuscripts inherited different variations depending on which ancestral document they was copied from. And Geisler and Turek makes a big fuss about how reliable the results is, which is kind of ironic considering that the same methodology is what allows us to reconstruct how living organisms inherited their mutations from their ancestral species. So according to Geisler and Turek, the same methodology is 100% reliable when Bible scholars use it, but completely unreliable when scientists use it. Go figure. But now on to the really big question about the New Testament documents. Quote, are they documents written soon after the events by eyewitnesses or by those who interviewed eyewitnesses, or are they documents written much later by biased followers who simply embellished details about the life of a real historical figure? End quote. And as far as the Gospels is concerned, that's an easy question. The earliest Gospel, commonly attributed to somebody named Mark, was written about 4 decades after the alleged events described in the Gospels. Matthew and Luke copied extensively from Mark, with modifications to suit their particular ideology within Christianity, and the author of the Gospel of John kind of comes right out and admits that he's writing explicitly to try and persuade folks to believe in Jesus. So yeah, pretty definitely written decades later by biased believers. But Geisler and Turek wants us to draw the opposite conclusion, and to reach that goal, they draws up what they call 7 historical tests that we're supposed to use to tell whether or not the New Testament is reliable. And here they are. Well, number 1, do we have early testimony? Number 2, do we have eyewitness testimony? Number 3, do we have testimony from multiple independent eyewitness sources? Number 4, are the eyewitnesses trustworthy? Number 5, do we have corroborating evidence from archaeology or other writers? Number 6, do we have any enemy attestation? Number 7, does the testimony contain events or details that are embarrassing to the authors? End quote. And hopefully I don't need to tell you that these ain't the kind of tests that actual historians use to determine which parts of ancient documents is reliable. Historians don't ask binary questions for which the only options are either yes, the witness is reliable or no, the witness ain't reliable. Historians look at the specific claims made by historical witnesses and ask how reliable is that claim. And even then, the answer ain't going to be a binary yes or no. It's going to be a confidence level like probably or probably not, or almost certainly not. So what Geisler and Turek is doing here ain't history. They setting up a list of 7 questions for which they've already got 7 answers that they think will convince their readers to believe everything the New Testament writers has to say just because they say so. As they put it, quote, in most cases, documents that meet most or all of these historical tests are considered trustworthy beyond a reasonable doubt, end quote. And notice the passive voice here. Considered trustworthy by who? Who's the authority that Geisler and Turek is appealing to here? Because it sure ain't historians. Historians don't work that way. Historians know that even folks with a reputation for trustworthiness can stretch the truth sometimes, and that you can't believe everything you hear. You gotta examine each claim on its own merits. And sure, the overall trustworthiness of the witness is a factor, but it ain't the only one. What Geisler and Turek is setting us up for here is an argument from authority fallacy. They want us to believe that the New Testament writers are the authorities on what happened during the life of Jesus, and therefore we just got to take their word for it whenever they say some kind of miracle happened. The last thing Geisler and Turek want us to do is to look at the New Testament documents the way an actual historian would, i.e. by evaluating each claim on its own merits. But now let's take a look at some of the historical tests that Geisler and Turek left off of their list. Number 1, did the witnesses actually see what they are testifying about? Number 2, is the witness's testimony motivated by strong personal convictions? Number 3, has the witness been cross-examined? Number 4, is the testimony realistic? Number 5, are significant details missing? Number 6, has the testimony changed over time? And number 7, is the testimony subject to multiple interpretations? When we're talking about documents written years or decades after the alleged events they claim to describe, these are some pretty important questions, if not downright crucial. But Geisler and Turek ain't asking them. They don't even want us to think about them. Their questions is about convincing us to believe whatever the New Testament writer tells us just because they say so, whereas my questions are about cross-examining the actual evidence. And that's the primary difference between an apologist's approach and a skeptic's approach. The apologist wants you to believe what you're told, and the skeptic wants you to draw conclusions based on the evidence. Geisler and Turek titled this book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, in order to create the false impression that they was going to be the real skeptics here and was going to be looking at the evidence. But even when they look at the evidence, they ain't looking at it the way a skeptic would. They claim to be looking at the evidence, but what they're really doing is just building a case for believing what you're told just because somebody told you. The next few sections of their book, they deal with 3 potential objections to the reliability of the New Testament writers, and I'm just going to summarize them real quick here. Can we know history? Of course we can. Nobody says otherwise. This one's just a straw man that Geisler and Turek put up so they can look victorious when they knock it down. Are miracles credible? No, they ain't, and Geisler and Turek's rebuttal is based on assuming that God exists, so that's basically a circular argument. Of course, they claim that they've already proved his existence, so that they're justified in using him to validate miracles, but as we saw before, their proofs all failed, so they're back to making circular arguments again. Were the New Testament writers biased? Obviously, yes, they were. Does this mean we can't trust any of their testimony? No, we don't. It just means that we need to take their testimony with a grain of salt, especially when it comes to religious claims. Geisler and Turek try to claim that their bias don't count on account they continue to preach Jesus even when they was persecuted, and why would anybody suffer for a lie? But that's an old one that's been debunked for a long time now. There may have been some brief periods of persecution in certain limited localities back in the New Testament times, but Christians back then was like Christians today, and they blew any real or imagined persecution all out of proportion to the actual facts because it's such a self-validating narrative. Plus, the historicity of various accounts of people being martyred for their faith is kind of doubtful. And the last potential objection, are converts objective? Geisler and Turek's answer is that just because you have strong feelings about something don't mean you can't be objective about things. And that's true, but it also don't mean that you can't be biased. And the tiebreaker here is that you have to fact-check claims made by folks who may or may not be biased, which is everybody. You got to fact-check everybody. Geisler and Turek is setting up another straw man by claiming that the skeptical position is that New Testament writers was biased and therefore we should reject the New Testament. But that ain't how skepticism works. The real skeptical position is that the New Testament writers were biased and therefore we need to fact-check their claims individually and each one on its own merits. If a New Testament testimony can't pass a basic fact check, that ain't skeptics being biased. That's the actual evidence being contrary to the New Testament claims. And if Geisler and Turek don't want to have enough faith to be an atheist, they ought to listen to the evidence. And I'm sure there's lots more that could be said, but that's going to about do it for me for today. Next time, Geisler and Turek is going to step through all of their so-called historical tests and give us their pre-packaged answers. And we're going to fact-check them. Meanwhile, thanks for watching, and please be kind wherever possible.